the most credible evidence for the support these people or these forces are receiving is the fact that Assad has been given refuge in Russia and that he is provided a safe haven to really operate from there.
At the center of this turmoil stands a polarizing figure, Bashar al-Assad. To some, he is a leader fighting to maintain sovereignty, but to others, a dictator accused of atrocities against his own people. I'm Miko, and joining me is Muhammad Zaman Khan. He will be helping us with respect to the issues surrounding the conflict in Syria. My guest, Muhammad, is a director for Center of Law in Justice and Policy and the head of Mooting for the past 6 months. And more importantly, he is a faculty member of Denning Law School and specializes in international protection of human rights law. Muhammad, welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure being here. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, Muhammad, as you can see, unlike the conflict in Palestine, the issue with respect to the Syrian conflict is not something that is as popular as the conflict in Gaza and the West Bank. But we're here to talk about human rights violations. So there were consequences under Bashar al-Assad's ruling. So people were detained, people were tortured, and eventually the rebellion ended all of those atrocities, so to speak. So now, Muhammad, kindly shed light on this matter and tell us, why is the Syrian conflict relevant today, and why should people talk about that?
Thank you so much, Miko, for the kind introduction. And I believe this is a great discussion. And as you said, there has not been enough discussion over this conflict, and this entire situation going on. The crisis in Syria has been largely ignored by the international community. When you're talking about Bashar al-Assad, we are talking about, as you said, a very interesting and polarizing figure, because this figure is a very interesting personality who rose to power from nowhere. Because if you understand his rise to power, you will see that he was, studying in the UK, becoming an ophthalmologist, and then suddenly, his elder brother Bassett, passed away, and then he had to come back and basically take over the reins of politics from his family. And so this person who was once a very kind, soft-spoken student in the UK, then later turned into this authoritarian nightmare to his own people in Syria. And, mostly when we talk about the Syrian suffering or the suffering of the Syrian people, the crisis itself, we start talking about it from 2011. But that is a mistake, because then we have to go back to all the way in 1970 when the Assad family really took over. And that is where the actual suffering of the Syrian people began. And that is where this entire authoritarian rule began with the coup. Because once the Assads took over, and especially when Bashar al-Assad took over, after in 2000s, there was a large economic and social grievance amongst the people. People were not happy with the economic policies. There was, high inflation, poverty, unemployment, and there were a lot of economic polarization and in the country itself. And economic liberalization policies by Bashar al-Assad really caused a lot of problems with the lower class or the working class people in Syria. And most of his economic policies were said to be benefiting the elites in the society. So that created that polarity between the people. And that really angered people, the larger population, to protest against this entire figure and this rule itself, because it was not financially viable for them to survive in Syria at that point because of the policies in place. But then we had the Arab Spring throughout the region. And in 2011, we saw that, Middle East, North Africa, countries like Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, the regimes were toppled, and there was a lot of protest against the regimes. And suddenly this in the Arab people came about, and they wanted to escape this authoritarian rules in these countries. And then seeing all these movements in different countries, the Syrian people also began peaceful protests. Now, it is to be noted that these movements started in Syria as peaceful protests, and the demands were simple. They demanded political reforms, they demanded freedom of expression, and they demanded an end to governmental corruption. Nothing which was against their rights. It was well within their own rights as the citizens of the country to demand for certain things. And they were just peacefully exercising this right to demand for their own well-being. And then suddenly what happened was that it all started with one action against an anti-governmental protest. If I recall correctly, it was in the southern city of Dara, and some students, student protesters painted anti-governmental slogans on the walls, and they were arrested and tortured by governmental authorities. And security forces were brutal with them, and I believe at least a dozen were killed, and more were even tortured. So this led to this entire anger amongst the people, because now they recognize that they are not safe in this country, and even the rulers and the government is going all out on them with this authoritarian rule. Something which was economically bad is now turning into a violent nightmare for them, right? So then this escalated into an armed conflict in mid-2011, where, Bashar al-Assad started a large crackdown on these masked protests, and these, a lot of people were arrested, tortured, and they responded with ammunition. Then what happened was that these defectors in the Syrian military, who were told to act against the people, certain military people defected against the government, and they formed the Free Syrian Army, right? So the FSA was formed then, and that is where an armed rebellion began against Bashar al-Assad's regime. And then we saw that, there was a fragmentation, and then, there was military campaigns between 2012, 2015. And suddenly, this entire condition in the country invited certain extremist groups as well to come into power. And, they had the Islamic State, the ISIS coming in, and they tried to exploit this chaos. And now they became a self-proclaimed caliphate, and they seized large, territories in Syria and Iraq, and they, brutally introduced this new dimension to the conflict. And this drew international attention finally. So the international attention was rather, drawn by the rise of ISIS between 2013 and 2017. And then again, there has been a huge international intervention, not for good, but rather that was also pretty polarizing, because then we had Russia. It was Russia's direct military intervention, Iran, the Hezbollah forces, and then also, there was a lot of military, financial, logistical support to the regime. And then there was a fragmentation in the international community. Some were supporting the rebels, the other was supporting, Bashar al-Assad's forces and the regime itself. And then there was a huge humanitarian impact. So if we were to really go on and understand all the international human rights violations that have occurred, they're tremendous. More than 500,000 people have been killed since 2011. And these are estimates by the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. And after which we have 6.6 million, at least 6.6 million Syrians who were internally displaced. And then another 5.6 million had to flee the country and go to Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan and Europe for their own survival. And then we had, destruction of infrastructure, Homs, Aleppo, these historical cities, historical sites were destroyed, schools were targeted, hospitals were targeted, and everything was reduced to rubble. And then, this is what really angered people more. But again, as you said, there was was pretty much ignored by the international community at that time. Then we had systematic torture and inhumane treatment. People were beaten with metal rods, they were electrocuted, there was sexual violence and humiliation against these people. There was starvation by the government, so we can call it state-induced starvation that was used to curb these protests. And then, some evidences that we have internationally that came about or was surfaced afterwards were the Caesar files, right? So the Caesar files is that had 50,000 photographs of tortured detainees that showed the world about the situation that was in these detainment centers and the kind of treatment they were receiving here. And then
And
another
there were
15,000
also
were.
there were also prisoners that were supposed to be executed on the day Bashar
Mhm.
al-Assad escaped or left his mansion, left the country. But
Absolutely.
then, because of
Absolutely.
that, the execution was not proceeded. So basically, the rebellion saved them. But had it not been for the rebellion, there were prisoners that were awaiting execution.
Absolutely. So, ever since the start of this regime to the very end of it, the very anticlimactic downfall of this regime, you will see human rights violations to the very end, right? And this is not only Bashar al-Assad acting against the rebellion itself, because you will see evidences of barrel bombs being used,
Yep.
where Assad's forces dropped barrel bombs on, densely populated areas, and there were a lot of casualties, mass casualties were made, which were schools, hospitals, and marketplaces. These dense populations were targeted, and then tens and thousands of civilians were killed, and entire neighborhoods were destroyed, right? Then we had, sexual violence, which were committed against, children and women, even men, right? And that left a lot of psychological harm on the survivors as well, with lifelong trauma, right? And then again, there was education was targeted. There was enforced disappearances that were made. People were disappeared. They suddenly disappeared, and then the families were left without the knowledge of their loved ones, what has happened to them. And it is to be said that there were around 100,000 people who have been displaced, have been disappeared, they were enforcedly disappeared
Yes.
since 2011. And at least 85% of these disappearances are directly attributed to Assad's regime. So you can understand that this was actually his own doing, right? And this was not even it, right? There was recruitment of child soldiers as well.
Yes.
The pro-regime militias, there was armed opposition groups which recruited children to fight in this scenario. And it was, of course, it was a direct breach of international law. But again, we're talking about a country that for the longest time was not abiding by any
Yes.
international obligation per se, because and even so, people were not able to, or journalists were not even able to freely cover what was happening in Syria at that
That is
time,
right.
because even journalists were targeted, right? Activists were targeted. There's no access. So there was impact on free speech. There was all kinds of humanitarian violence, and another, and not if you even put the livelihood on one side, there was a lot of economic impact that was sustained, right? So even people who were not a direct victim of violence had to suffer from poverty and mass unemployment and loss of livelihood, right? We had around 90% of Syrians right now. I believe around 90% of Syrians are below poverty line, which is a huge, it exposes all the economic devastations that were carried on, along with the lives that were lost. And then humanitarian access was not met. There's also this international demand at the moment for all these international crimes and these war crimes that were committed by Assad to be really brought into court, and for him to be held accountable for that. And not only him, but also the other actors that were
Other
involved.
officials.
And it's just a very sad state of affair. And this is something which right now we can see that it came to an end. But still, at this moment, there are some pro-Assad forces and groups within the military who are trying to constantly create that chaos and trying to bring him back into power. So now we have to see when it really ends for good. But for now, still there is a huge, a pro-Assad group that is operating within the military right now, even.
So what you're saying, Muhammad, is despite the fact that Assad is now in exile in Moscow, I guess, Moscow,
Mm-hmm.
Russia. So despite the
Mm-hmm.
fact that he left Syria, Bashar al-Assad's absence, as you're saying, does not necessarily eliminate the forces that are in full support of Bashar al-Assad. So despite the fact that there's another force or another government that is taking over Syria, how does these pro-Assad forces maintain their power or maintain their resources, despite the fact that Of course, they might be detained by the new government. What are the motivation of these people to still stand upon their own conviction?
I mean, for once, I believe the most credible evidence for support these people or these forces are receiving is the fact that Assad has been given refuge in Russia, and that he is provided a safe haven to really operate
Exactly.
from there. So this really also shows you that there is also a financial, backing that is coming from different areas of the world, and it's not only the governmental money that was being used, but rather international money from other taxpayers around the world that was being put into this conflict to really, move or sway away the power regime. But you can see right now, I believe, Bashar al-Assad, since he's in a safe haven at the moment, you can say that he has the time and the resources to really control or to even try to, try to influence what is happening in Syria. So as long as he has pro-Assad forces or pro-Assad Syria, he will keep maintaining his power.
So this is our land, it's our right, and it's our duty to liberate it. And the American should leave somehow.
Now, we talked about the pro-Assad forces. So meaning they support the former president of Syria. They pledge allegiance to the president of Syria or the former government. Now, what we want to understand is, why was there a rebellion in the first place? So you've discussed there were human rights violations, economic policies that were detrimental to the people, which understandably could lead to a revolution. But I understand that there are more than one groups alongside Syria, that there are separate groups. For example, the ISIS, the current succeeded in invading or taking control of the presidential headquarters, and other groups that are in the northern part of Syria. Now, what do you think motivated these groups, and why were they not united? Why do they have labels? Why do they have separate names? And why do they have separate leaders? I mean, I just want to our audience to understand that the rebellion did not come out of nowhere, just like the Hamas, just like the Hezbollah, just like other resistance forces all around the world. They had a motivation. They had a certain anger. They had a certain desire for change. Now, I understand that Hamas and Hezbollah are dominant in each of their own regions. But in Syria, what I see is a unique situation where we have different groups, and those groups it's either they're fighting each other or simultaneously fighting the government and fighting each other. We all know that also have several encounters with other groups. I want to understand the psychology behind not uniting as one group, but instead maintain separate forces. So I guess they have different ideals, different motivations, and different agendas.
Absolutely. I feel like the one thing that really has been a huge, element of divide in Syria is actually the sectarian divide, right? So in Syria, we have two different Muslim sects that coexist. So we have the Sunni sect,
and Shia.
The Sunni and the Shia sect, right? And the population of Syria, I believe, is around 75 to 80% of them are Sunnis, and around 10 to 15% are Shias who are from the Alawite Shia. Yeah, the Alawite sect of Shia. So now this was actually that was against the that went against the of the rebellion against Assad himself, because Assad was a part of the Alawite minority, and the population itself was from the Sunni majority, right? So this sectarian divide also led to this greater anger, because there has been evidence whereby it states that the minority was given precedence and was supported by the Assad regime over the Sunni majority. So that led to it exaggerating and exacerbating the sectarian divide in the country. And this is not only an isolated divide that we have seen, the Shia and Sunni divide
We also have
in
this
the
in
world.
Iraq. We also have this in
Absolutely.
Iraq and other Arab countries.
Absolutely. It's in a lot of the Muslim countries, you'll see this divide between the two sects, and this divide has led to really a lot of oppression of different groups, and led to a lot of conflict between interreligious conflict between these two sects. And hence, when you ask about the lack of unity between these groups, it is actually also a major reason, right? Because a lot of these groups operate between different sects, and they hold different sectarian values as well. And in fact, this was the reason why the downfall of Assad was also, it also had a element to it, more than just as you said, an economic or human rights element that was involved. So the ideal scenario or outcome that ISIS would want from this conflict is way different from FSA, right? The Free Syrian Army. So these different, when we talked about the fragmentation that took place between this, rebellion itself, we saw these groups operating with different ideals, with different agendas, with different outcomes, and with different support from the international community as well. So there has been allegations of different international support being pooled in for these certain groups. Exactly. Foreign intervention, right? Exactly. So that foreign intervention, of course, also gives a new angle to the agendas or the outcomes they seek. And hence you have this entire divide in the country whereby these groups are operating on their own, and they all want a different result. Yes, they all agree on getting rid of Bashar al-Assad. They're all against Bashar al-Assad. But what they want in place of Bashar al-Assad is different for each group that's operating right now.
That is my concern, because with the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham being the one in power right now, I am guessing, and a certain possibility, that not everyone in Syria right now is happy. Correct me if I'm wrong. Is the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is that a Sunni
Yes.
sectarian group?
Yes.
Okay, so now how are the Shias dealing with this current situation wherein they have someone in the Sunni sect that is in power?
Exactly. So this is the problem, right? Because the issue is that sometimes this entire scenario, and again, as I said, the sectarian sectarian point of view here is a very important element, because of the fact that this, again, while it is understood that the Shia sect is in minority, still they have also they have their disagreements with the Sunni majorities operating within the countries, because groups like ISIS have also explicitly they've also targeted in the past a lot of Shia groups, and there has been mass suffering of the Shia community itself by the hands of these groups. So now, again, this is a very there's a lot of turmoil, and the situation itself, as you said, is very chaotic. And the only problem here is to identify the one right solution, the piece of the puzzle that really aligns everything in Syria. Because the problem with all of these, Middle Eastern countries has really been that the fall of one tyrannic regime or authoritarian rule has not necessarily led to the rise of a good ruler or a more democratic regime. But mostly we have seen the countries, after the downfall, they go into hands of people or groups which are the same or even worse. So it is yet to be decided. But again, as you said, the interaction between the groups is a particularly interesting one, because now we will see a Sunni majority group taking power in a Sunni majority population. Now they don't have a voice in the government per se. So that can lead to a lot of oppression and backlash to the community itself, because there's a lot of grievances that the Sunni community has held against the Alawite minority during Assad's regime.
Let's talk about the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or the HTS. which is, of course, led by Muhammad al-Julani, a very controversial figure, a former member of the Al-Qaeda, of course. But people are willing enough to let that go because he has toppled the dictatorship in Syria. Tell us more about this group and what effect can the victory of HTS have on the Shia minority in Syria?
Absolutely. I feel like this is again, as I said before, sometimes in these regions and when the conditions are so volatile, one downfall of an authoritarian rule might not necessarily lead to good times for the country itself, but rather might end up becoming a start of another authoritarian and traumatic rule, violent rule for the country itself. So now, talking about HTS again is something which might not be considered very well for the Shia minority, which exists in the region or in Syria, right? So this Alawite minority, this is not good news for the minority because of the fact that this country, again, has a sectarian divide, and HTS is a Islamic militant group which was very closely linked with Al-Qaeda. It was formerly known as Jabhat al-Nusra, if I'm not wrong. And Al-Qaeda has a very strict Sunni extremist ideology, right? And it has really, it has shown around the world about what kind of activities they have performed, right? So it's not, unknown to anyone. And then there's also the sectarian ideology that the HTS really follows, right, or adheres to. So HTS really adheres to the Salafi jihadist worldview, right, which considers Shia Muslims as heretics, right? So this ideological foundation will be used to justify violence against the Shia minority in Syria now, right? And historically, such extremist groups such as HTS have really been involved in targeted killings, forced conversions, and destruction of Shia religious sites. So we have seen in the past, there was an attack on the Alawite community, and then there was destruction of Shia mosques as well. And these groups, they operate on the very basis of calling Shias as heretics and considering them as heretic.
Muhammad,
So this extremist activity, yes.
for the benefit of our non-Muslim audience, perhaps they might be confused. Why do the Sunni hate the Shias, or why do they consider them as heretics? We all know that the Sunni adheres to Abu Bakr being the successor of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Just briefly, a few seconds or a few minutes, briefly discuss us what the Shia Muslims believe that as a consequence of such belief by the Shias, the Sunni are prepared to almost, forgive me for using this word, to eradicate them or almost eliminate them from the places where Sunnis are. Well, not all Sunnis, but we understand, we need to understand the thought process or the ideology behind the hate against Shias for our non-Muslim audience.
No, absolutely. I feel like, the really emergence of this divide, it's not something new. This is something which has been going on since the very beginning. And, this is something that we have seen that there are a lot of actions around the world that have been linked towards, violence against the Shia community. And there was a lot of, inter-sectarian divide and violence that has occurred. Of course, there's, honestly, the divide itself is more targeted, and it's not very religious per se, the divide itself, but rather the divide, yes, there are religious differences between, the Shia sect and the Sunni sect as well, whereby the Shia sect is more the ideology and the belief system also specifically is linked with there's some slight difference in the practice and how the religion is practiced exactly. However, this actual divide that has occurred or is right now existing is a result of extremist groups operating, right? And these extremist groups really trying to interpret certain actions of the other party as, as in contravention to their beliefs. And hence, nowadays, it's turned into more of a battle between the most followed or the most righteous belief system within the religion itself, right? And that, I believe, is the actual point of contention between the two sects at the point. Yes.
Is it fair to say that these extremist groups capitalize on the religious divide to justify their violent actions? Because not all Sunnis, I'm not speaking for them, but I have a optimism, or I have a belief, or I have faith that some of the Sunnis, despite the difference in their religious belief, do not really intend to exert violence upon the Shias, despite the religious divide. So is it fair enough to say that extremist groups use religion to exert violence against the Shias? And in the context of our conversation, to connect it with Syria, is it fair to say that the HTS will, in the future, well, it's not apparent now, is it fair to say that the HTS could potentially commit violence against the Shia minority in Syria?
Absolutely. I feel like this is a very good question because, again, not all Sunnis are against Shias, or not all Shias are against Sunnis. Honestly, there are parts of the world where both sects peacefully coexist.
Peacefully, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. They coexist, and this has been. I feel like this is again something that religious extremism leads to, and these extremist groups really, try to exert this. And a similar scenario has been seen in Christianity as well. When you talk about the conflict of Catholics and Protestants, right? In the Holy Roman Empire,
the Holy
right?
Wars.
Yeah, the Holy Wars. The Catholic rulers sought to suppress the Protestantism at that time, and they often expelled Protestants or forcibly converted them. So
the Inquisition too.
Again, at that time, exactly.
There's a parallel between those timelines, right?
Exactly, absolutely. And that time, you saw it all ended with the Peace of Westphalia, and then there were different principles of religious tolerance that were established between the Catholics and Protestants. So yes, again, and that time, it'd be harsh to say that all Catholics were against Protestants or all Protestants were against Catholics, but rather these people who sometimes, become the flag bearers of that extremist ideology often lead people to act in a certain way that is against the other community, right? And a similar situation really exists right now. Now, coming to the second question about HTS and how this will lead to any good or bad in Syria, it is yet to be seen. Because yes, HTS does have a very bad history when it comes to their tolerance with the Alawite Shia minority. However, it is yet to be seen as to how this entire sectarian divide will play or will not have a play in the new government of Syria, right? Because currently, I believe if the HTS is to actually consider the actual problems in Syria, they would literally just want to ignore, and they should ignore the sectarian divide and focus on the actual problems in the country, the suffering of the people. With 90% people, the population under the poverty line, I believe the first priority for any new government should be to really try to better the economic suffering or try to take your population out of the economic suffering, right? So yes, on paper, we do not really have a good history from HTS. When you see what they have done in the past,
the track record.
Exactly, it's not clean. So yes, there are doubts, and of course there are fears that the Alawite community and the Shia community and the world also has with them coming into power again. But what will happen is yet to be seen, and only time will tell how this regime will repeat the mistakes of the past or actually step up and try to focus on actual problems rather than on religious divide.
But Muhammad al-Julani, in one of his speeches, well, he promised to exercise tolerance between religions, because as we all know, there are also Christians in Syria. There are also other sectarian groups, religions in Syria,
Absolutely.
not just Shia and Sunni. So, is it well, I would like to be optimistic, but now that we're here in this religious divide and in connection with the Syrian conflict, we all know that religion has an element in this conflict. Well, not all. Extremism also has a part in this conflict. Economic turmoil has a part in this conflict. And you've also discussed earlier, human rights violation has also a part in this conflict. Now, what about the history of the family, the first family? Muhammad, imagine from the father to the son, and were it not for Bashar's brother being killed in an accident, he would have been somewhere else, treating patients that have eye problems, being an ophthalmologist. And of course, recent news tells us that he's planning to practice ophthalmology in Russia, but that is irrelevant. But I just want to have a clearer picture. Was the father of Bashar al-Assad instantly or immediately a dictator when he initially took power in Syria? And if yes, Bashar al-Assad, in his initial years of governing the state of Syria, surprisingly, he was not immediately a dictator. So there was even a promise that Bashar al-Assad will not follow the footsteps of his father, but of course, we all know what happened. Still, he became a dictator in the end. So take us back to the time when his father ruled. Did his father immediately establish a dictatorial rule, or was it motivated by some other factors?